3 days before the biggest signing ceremony of the year, a company refused to pay a quiet, single man $40 for 8 hours of honest work and told him to take it to court if he wanted it that badly. Nobody in that glass tower stopped to ask what he had spent the day doing, or why his hands still carried faint traces of concrete dust when he stood at the payment counter, waiting patiently for a form that never seemed to arrive. Daniel Ashford didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the counter or demand a manager the way another man might have after being humiliated in front of a lobby full of strangers. He simply zipped his laptop bag shut, slid his folder of photographs and readings back inside it, and walked out into the cold autumn rain that had been falling over Denver since morning. His collar went up against the wind as he crossed the parking lot without once glancing back at the building behind him. What none of them understood, not the receptionist who laughed under her breath, not the accountant who shrugged it off, not even the woman who'd ordered him to wait as if his time meant nothing, was that the man walking out of their building was the only structural risk consultant who had actually found the flaw hidden inside their newest tower, a flaw that could unravel a deal worth more than $1 billion. 72 hours later, in front of bankers, partners, and reporters, in the middle of the company's most important signing of the year, the room would fall silent as investors stared down at the very report the company had mocked, and the number at the bottom of the settlement would read $12 million, a figure that would follow the company's name through headlines for months. Daniel Ashford was 41, and he'd built a quiet, steady life around precision. He worked as an independent structural inspector and risk assessor, the kind of professional companies called when they wanted a second set of eyes they could trust completely, someone with no stake in the outcome except the truth. Divorced for several years, living alone now in a modest apartment on Denver's East Side, his days ran on discipline rather than sentiment. He measured twice, documented everything, and never put his name to anything he hadn't personally verified. Colleagues described him almost identically over the years: unhurried, unshakable, impossible to rattle. The kind of man who could deliver bad news about a failing beam in the same even tone he'd used to discuss the weather. He'd learned that steadiness early, back when a louder, more excitable inspector might have been written off as an alarmist and ignored. Quiet certainty, he'd come to believe, carried farther than noise ever could. That morning, Harrogate Urban Holdings had called him in on short notice, needing an emergency inspection finished in a single day before their flagship tower could be cleared for a major investment closing. The call came from a frazzled mid-level project coordinator who explained that their usual inspection firm had a scheduling conflict and that the timeline couldn't slip, not even by a day. Daniel cleared his calendar, packed his laser equipment, his cameras, his notebooks, and arrived before sunrise to walk every floor of the structure. He worked alone, as always, moving from the underground levels upward with methodical patience, pausing at every junction, every seam, every place where one material met another, carrying the quiet certainty that thoroughness now would prevent far greater trouble later. By the time the sun was fully up over the skyline, he'd logged more measurements than most inspectors take in a full week, filling page after page of his notebook in careful, legible handwriting that left no confusion later. By early afternoon, he'd finished the full survey, working through mechanical rooms, load-bearing corridors, and the underground parking structure carrying the entire weight of the building above. He gave every section the same unhurried thoroughness, crouching beside support columns, running a gloved hand along concrete seams, cross-checking each area against the blueprints on his tablet. Something on the third sublevel caught his attention immediately, a section of reinforcement that didn't match the original specifications on file, the kind of detail invisible to anyone not specifically trained to look for it. He photographed it from several angles, took laser measurements to confirm the deviation, and noted the anomaly carefully in his preliminary report before continuing, unwilling to let the discovery rush the rest of his work. When the inspection was finished, he submitted his findings to the front desk exactly as instructed, a printed summary plus a note that a fuller report would follow within the day, and asked politely about payment for the day's work, a modest $40 processing fee, separate from the full consulting invoice he'd bill later through standard channels. The woman at the counter looked at her screen, frowned, and said there was a delay, something about a missing signature from finance she couldn't resolve herself. Daniel nodded and said he'd wait, setting his equipment case down beside the bench without a hint of impatience. He waited nearly 2 hours in the lobby, seated on a leather bench beneath a wall of framed architectural awards. Employees passed him without a glance, phones to their ears, coffee in hand, the ordinary rhythm of a company convinced nothing could touch it. Twice he approached the desk to ask, politely, whether there was an update. Twice the young receptionist gave the same apologetic shrug. Finance ran on its own schedule, and there was little she could do to speed it up. Daniel thanked her both times and returned to the bench without complaint, reviewing his photographs on his tablet while he waited. Eventually, the CEO herself crossed the lobby on her way to a meeting. Elena Harrogate was 39, sharp-featured, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that made her look like she'd stepped off a business magazine cover. She noticed him only because an assistant murmured something about a vendor complaint, glancing toward the man near the awards wall. When she learned the entire holdup concerned a sum as small as $40, she let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed off the marble.
$40, she repeated, loud enough for the small cluster of nearby employees to hear, and asked if he was really planning to sit there over an amount that small when people in this building were closing deals worth more than his entire yearly income. A few of the younger staff laughed along, the kind of laughter that comes not from real amusement, but from the instinct to align with power. Daniel looked up from his seat, met her eyes for a moment, and said nothing at all, which seemed to irritate her more than any protest could have. Elena turned to her assistant without waiting for a response, and said simply that he could wait, that finance would get to it eventually, and that she had a meeting that mattered considerably more than a vendor invoice for pocket change. Daniel said nothing. He watched her disappear down the corridor toward the executive elevators, heels clicking sharply against the marble. When the accountant finally returned with a form labeled Unpaid Services Pending Review, he read it once, signed it without complaint, and slid it back across the counter without a trace of frustration. He gathered his equipment, buttoned his coat against the chill creeping in every time the doors opened, and walked out through the revolving doors into the rain that had been building steadily all afternoon, the kind of steady autumn rain that soaks through fabric slowly rather than all at once. Nobody who watched him leave imagined that the calm, unremarkable man crossing the parking lot was carrying inside a worn leather folder the single most important piece of information the company would need in the days ahead, and that his silence in that lobby wasn't resignation, but the quiet decision of a man who'd learned long ago that dignity doesn't require raising your voice. On the drive home, Daniel stopped at a red light and reached for his tablet, paging back through the images from the third sublevel. The deviation bothered him the more the longer he studied it. The original architectural plans called for a specific grade of reinforced steel across the primary load-bearing beams supporting the tower's north wing, but the material actually installed didn't match those specifications, subtle enough that a rushed inspection might have missed it, the kind of difference that only reveals itself under close measurement, not a casual glance. Daniel had spent 2 decades learning to spot exactly this kind of quiet substitution, the sort that saves a contractor money in the short term while leaving a structure vulnerable under sustained stress over years of use.
He pulled into a spot outside his apartment and sat there with the engine off for several minutes, cross-referencing his laser readings against the manufacturer's specifications in his files, checking and rechecking until he was certain there was no error in his own measurements. Left uncorrected, the deficiency would likely fail to meet the standards required by the building's insurance underwriters, a detail that could jeopardize far more than the tower itself. Beyond the immediate safety concern, Daniel understood that any serious investment partner's due diligence process would eventually uncover the same discrepancy, whether through his report or a separate inspection commissioned later. The responsible course, as he saw it, was simple and required no dramatics. Someone at Harrogate Urban Holdings needed to know, needed to fix the deficiency, and needed to do it before outside parties relied on the building's safety rating to make decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. He had no interest in punishing anyone or proving a point. He wanted only for the correction to happen. That evening, from his kitchen table, Daniel composed a formal warning email to Harrogate Urban Holdings, attaching his photographs, his laser readings, and a clear written explanation of the risk he'd identified. He wrote plainly, in neutral technical language, describing the deviation and recommending a follow-up inspection before any documentation moved forward to outside parties. He sent it to the project manager, copied the general engineering compliance address, and waited, checking his inbox periodically that evening more out of habit than expectation. No reply came that night, nor the next morning when he tried following up by phone. The call went unanswered 3 times before a receptionist finally picked up and told him somewhat awkwardly that his email address had been blocked from the company's internal system entirely. The decision had been made quietly at Elena's request, after she was briefed on the persistent inspector still trying to reach her office, a request she issued almost as an afterthought between 2 other meetings, treating the matter as a nuisance rather than anything requiring real attention. Gregory Voss, the company's chief counsel, told a junior staffer plainly that nobody needed to bother the CEO over a matter involving $40, and that if the inspector had a real concern, he could put it in writing and mail it the traditional way, knowing full well how long that process could take and how easily it could be ignored once it arrived. Daniel, for his part, didn't escalate or threaten legal action, and he didn't try to reach anyone else at the company after learning his access had been cut off. He simply saved every email he sent, time-stamped and organized into a folder labeled with the building's address, along with screenshots confirming delivery status and the eventual bounce-back notifications once his address was blocked. He printed hard copies, too, a habit from earlier in his career, and filed them chronologically in a binder in his home office. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't preparation for revenge, only the same discipline that governed every part of his work, quietly building a record that no one at Harrogate Urban Holdings yet understood they would come to need. Inside the tower, preparations for the largest transaction in the company's history moved forward without pause, oblivious to the quiet warning sitting unread in a blocked inbox somewhere in the building's own servers. Elena Harrogate was preparing to close a deal worth $1.4 billion with one of the most respected investment funds in the country. An agreement that would transform her company from a regional developer into a national name recognized far beyond Denver. The whole office had been swept into a mood of celebration weeks in advance, banners quietly commissioned, catering arranged, press releases drafted well before a single signature had touched paper. Every detail of the closing ceremony rehearsed down to the minute. Elena gave interviews to business journalists that week, speaking with total confidence about the soundness of her flagship property, insisting there was no risk whatsoever in the underlying asset, that every inspection had come back clean, and that investors could trust the numbers completely. She believed this not because she had verified it herself, but because she'd never needed to before. Money had always solved her problems, smoothed over her oversights, and silenced the people who might have told her otherwise. Nothing in her experience so far had given her reason to expect this time would be different.
Sarah Whitfield, the company's quality control director, was not so certain. At 35, she'd spent years quietly reviewing documentation behind the scenes, rarely getting credit but taking her responsibilities seriously regardless, the kind of employee whose work only becomes visible when something goes wrong. As she assembled the final compliance binder for the investment fund's due diligence team, cross-referencing every page against a checklist she'd built and refined over years of similar closings, she noticed a critical gap: the absence of a final signed verification from the independent structural consultant who'd completed the emergency inspection days earlier. Without that signature, the entire compliance package was technically incomplete, a detail that could raise uncomfortable questions if anyone examined it closely, and one her training told her couldn't simply be overlooked, no matter how minor it seemed to everyone else. She brought the concern directly to Elena, expecting a simple instruction to resolve it. Instead, Elena waved her off without looking up from her desk, saying there was no need to worry about a minor formality from a contractor nobody would remember the following week. Elena left the office troubled, and later that evening, without telling anyone, she found Daniel Ashford's contact information in the vendor records and called a number she'd been explicitly told not to use. They met the next afternoon in a small coffee shop several blocks from the tower, chosen deliberately so neither of them would be seen together by anyone from the company. Sarah arrived first, taking a table near the back where the noise of the espresso machine would cover their conversation from anyone wandering too close. When Daniel walked in a few minutes later, carrying his laptop and the same leather folder he'd walked out with days earlier, she almost didn't recognize him without the fluorescent lobby lighting washing out his features. He greeted her with a brief nod, ordered black coffee, and sat down across from her without any of the tension she'd expected from a man treated so poorly by her employer only days before. He opened the files without hesitation, the photographs of the substituted material, the laser measurements documenting the deviation, the time-stamped video from the third sublevel, and the written record of every email that had gone unanswered. He explained each piece of evidence patiently, translating the technical language into terms she could follow, pointing out exactly where the installed material diverged from the specifications on file, and what that meant for the tower's ability to withstand sustained structural stress over time. He told her plainly he'd never wanted a confrontation, only for someone with authority to fix a mistake before it became dangerous, and that he'd assumed, maybe naively, that a company this size would have a straightforward process for handling exactly this kind of warning. The color drained from Sarah's face as she paged through the evidence on his laptop, understanding immediately that this wasn't a minor paperwork issue, but a structural deficiency serious enough to threaten the safety rating of the entire building, and by extension, the deal her company was racing to close. She asked him several pointed questions, testing the strength of his data the way her training had taught her, looking for any weakness or ambiguity that might explain why the company had dismissed his warning so easily. She found none. Every measurement was documented, every photograph time-stamped, every claim cross-referenced against the original blueprints. By the time she finished, her hands were faintly trembling, not from fear exactly, but from the growing certainty that she was sitting across from the only person in the entire organization who'd told the truth from the beginning. Sarah returned to the office that evening and brought the printed report directly to Elena, laying it on the desk and explaining as calmly as she could manage exactly what the numbers meant and why the timing mattered so much. Elena barely glanced at the first page before her expression hardened, the polished composure she wore for reporters slipping for a moment into something colder and more impatient. She picked up the report and, without a word of explanation, tore it in half in front of her, letting the pages fall onto the desk between them, and told her she refused to let a $40 contractor derail a deal that had taken 18 months to negotiate and represented the single largest achievement of her career. Sarah tried to explain the legal exposure the company would face if the fund discovered the deficiency after closing, laying out in careful detail how a concealed structural defect could unravel far more than the immediate transaction. But Elena was no longer listening, her attention already shifting to the stack of unrelated messages on her desk. Within the hour, Sarah was called into human resources, and her position was eliminated effective immediately, her access badge deactivated before she'd even cleared out her desk. Years of careful, thankless work reduced to a single line in a termination file. Gregory Voss, watching the situation unfold from his office down the hall, grew increasingly uneasy as the day progressed. He reminded Elena privately, choosing his words with the caution of a man who'd learned not to push too hard against her certainty, that with Sarah gone, the company no longer had anyone internally tracking the independent inspection records, and that if the investment fund's own technical team asked for final documentation, there would be nothing complete to show them. Elena dismissed the concern outright, insisting no investor in their right mind would walk away from a deal this size over a missing signature, and that she'd handle any questions personally if they came up, waving off her hesitation the same way she'd waved off Sarah's warning only hours earlier. Meanwhile, the investment fund's compliance department sent a routine but firm request for the final signed structural verification report ahead of the closing date, a standard step in any transaction of this size. Rather than reaching out to Daniel to resolve the matter honestly, an option that would have cost her nothing more than a phone call in a moment of humility, Elena instructed a junior associate to produce a substitute document, one that recreated the format of Daniel's report, but altered the critical findings to state that no deficiencies had been identified anywhere in the structure. She reviewed the falsified version herself before it was sent, made a small note about adjusting the formatting to look more official, and approved it without hesitation, believing it would never be checked against the original and that the matter would quietly disappear.
What Elena didn't know was that Nathan Cole, the 56-year-old chairman of the investment fund preparing to finalize the acquisition, had a long-standing habit of verifying anything that seemed too clean. Something about the abrupt turnover in Harrogate's quality control department, mentioned only in passing by a junior staffer during a routine call, struck him as worth a closer look. Rather than raising the issue through official channels, Nathan quietly had his assistant track down the original inspector listed in the company's vendor records. Within a day, Daniel Ashford received a formal letter requesting a private meeting, signed personally by the chairman himself. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at the fund's downtown offices, far removed from the polished theatrics of Harrogate's headquarters. No marble, no glass, just a plain wooden table, a carafe of water, and tall windows overlooking the river. Nathan didn't ask about the $40, didn't mention the lobby incident at all, though he was already aware of it through channels of his own, having spent enough years in business to know that the way a company treats the smallest people in a transaction often reveals more than any balance sheet. He asked only one question, direct and unadorned, whether the report attributed to Daniel was genuine. Daniel opened his laptop and walked him through everything: the original photographs, the laser measurements, the time-stamped video, the entire chain of emails that had gone deliberately ignored. He spoke without embellishment, letting the data carry the weight of the argument rather than his own tone. Nathan listened without interruption, occasionally leaning in to examine an image more closely, asking sharp, specific questions about tolerance thresholds and load calculations that made clear he understood more about structural engineering than most executives in his position ever bothered to learn. When Daniel finished, Nathan sat back for a long moment, then instructed his own technical team to independently verify every claim against the building's blueprints and material certifications, insisting on a full review rather than a cursory glance. 2 days of quiet cross-checking followed, conducted by a small team of engineers Nathan trusted implicitly, none connected to Harrogate Urban Holdings or invested in any particular outcome. Their findings confirmed Daniel's original report was accurate down to the smallest detail, a full, precise match with no discrepancies anywhere in the data. Nathan made his decision immediately, freezing the entire investment pending further review, though he chose to say nothing publicly for the moment, preferring to gather every fact before taking any action that couldn't be undone. Elena Harrogate, still preparing banners and press statements for the closing ceremony, had no idea the deal she believed was already secured had quietly stopped moving 3 days before she was scheduled to sign it, her confidence undisturbed by a decision already made without her knowledge. The morning of the signing arrived with the kind of polished confidence that only comes from never having been told no. Harrogate Urban Holdings had transformed its top floor into a showcase of success. Reporters gathered near the windows, banking representatives seated along a long glass table, partners from 3 continents watching remotely through a live video feed projected on the far wall. Waitstaff circulated with trays of coffee and sparkling water, and a photographer moved along the perimeter, capturing candid shots for the next morning's coverage. The floor smelled faintly of fresh flowers arranged in tall vases near the entrance, a detail Elena personally approved the week before. Elena stood at the head of the room in a deep blue suit, delivering a speech about vision, growth, and the unshakable strength of her company's flagship property, her voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her bathroom mirror for months. She spoke of trust, partnership, and a future built on solid foundations, gesturing occasionally toward the architectural renderings displayed on easels beside her, entirely unaware of how literally that phrase was about to be tested in front of every camera in the room. Gregory Voss stood near the back, arms folded, watching with an unease he hadn't been able to shake since Sarah's departure, though he said nothing and kept his expression carefully neutral. As the final documents were placed on the table for signature, Nathan Cole rose slowly from his seat instead of reaching for a pen. The room quieted, uncertain at first if this was simply part of the ceremony. Nathan reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a bound document, setting it deliberately in the center of the table where every camera could see it clearly. It was the original structural report, complete with Daniel Ashford's photographs, his laser readings, and his signature at the bottom of the final page, the very report Elena once dismissed as unworthy of her attention. A hush spread across the room as reporters leaned forward, phones already recording. Elena's practiced smile faltered as her eyes landed on the signature at the bottom of the page, a name she'd once heard mentioned in passing and never bothered to remember. Nathan addressed the room calmly, without theatrics, in the same measured tone he'd used in his private meeting with Daniel days earlier. He explained that his fund's own engineers had independently verified every finding in the report, that the deficiency it described posed a direct risk to the safety rating underpinning the entire investment, and the document previously submitted to his compliance team, the one claiming no issues existed, didn't match this original in its critical findings. His legal counsel, he said, would be reviewing the discrepancy immediately, along with the circumstances surrounding how 2 conflicting reports had come to exist in the first place. The bankers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves, and one reporter near the back was already typing furiously on her phone, sensing the story she'd come to cover had just changed entirely. Elena opened her mouth to respond, searching for the practiced confidence that had carried her through every difficult moment of her career, the same instinct that let her laugh off a man waiting quietly in her lobby. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, no words came at all. Within the hour, the investment fund issued a formal statement announcing it was suspending the transaction entirely, citing material misrepresentation in the due diligence documentation provided by Harrogate Urban Holdings. The statement was brief, carefully worded by legal counsel, and made no direct accusations, though anyone reading between the lines understood exactly what had happened. Under the terms of the preliminary agreement both parties had signed, the suspension triggered a significant penalty clause requiring Harrogate to compensate the fund for costs, reputational damage, and lost opportunity from the failed closing. The final figure, calculated by the fund's legal team over the following days, came to $12 million, a number that appeared in financial headlines by the end of the week.
News of the collapsed deal spread quickly through financial circles, moving from trading floors to industry newsletters within hours. By the next morning, Harrogate's stock had fallen sharply as long-standing partners began quietly withdrawing from other joint ventures, unwilling to be associated with a company whose credibility had just been publicly shattered on camera. Elena attempted damage control through a series of hastily arranged interviews, insisting the discrepancy was a simple misunderstanding between contractors and that her company remained committed to the highest standards of safety and transparency. But the explanation convinced almost no one, least of all the reporters who'd watched the moment unfold live in that glass conference room and had already reviewed the falsified report themselves. As the fund's legal team began its formal inquiry into the collapsed transaction, Gregory Voss discovered something that turned an embarrassing business failure into a far more serious legal exposure. Working late one evening to prepare a defense strategy, Gregory asked an internal technician to restore the blocked email account out of simple due diligence, expecting to find little of consequence. Instead, buried in the company's own servers, untouched since the day it was blocked, sat the complete chain of emails Daniel had sent weeks earlier, each one time-stamped, each one detailing the exact deficiency later confirmed by independent engineers. Each one met with silence or deliberate obstruction. Gregory read through the entire chain twice, his stomach sinking further with each message, understanding immediately how damaging the record would look to any outside investigator. The evidence made clear that Harrogate Urban Holdings hadn't simply overlooked a risk through carelessness, but had been formally warned repeatedly and in writing, and had chosen instead to block the warning, discredit the inspector, and manufacture a false document rather than address the problem honestly while there was still time. The fund's legal team moved quickly once the pattern became clear, formally requesting all internal correspondence related to the inspection, along with sworn statements from anyone involved in producing the falsified compliance report. Sarah Whitfield, though no longer employed by the company, agreed without hesitation to provide a full account of what she'd witnessed, including the moment Elena had torn the original report in half in front of her, and the conversation that followed about the missing signature. She answered every question directly and without exaggeration, providing dates, details, and context that matched precisely with the email trail already recovered from the company's servers. Her testimony, combined with the recovered correspondence, left little room for Harrogate's legal team to maneuver or offer any alternative explanation. Elena Harrogate was formally required to accept responsibility for authorizing the falsified document, a decision carrying both significant financial penalties and lasting professional consequences that would follow her well beyond the immediate settlement. Gregory Voss, unwilling to keep defending decisions he'd quietly warned against from the beginning, resigned within the week, telling colleagues privately he couldn't in good conscience remain at a company that had chosen deception over a simple correction that would have cost almost nothing to make. Harrogate Urban Holdings, once celebrated in industry publications for its rapid growth and ambitious vision, found its name now attached to headlines about corporate negligence and lost investor trust, a reputation built carefully over more than a decade, unraveling in a matter of days because of a decision that had seemed, at the time, almost too small to matter. Roughly a week after the collapsed signing, Elena Harrogate asked through an intermediary whether Daniel Ashford would be willing to meet her in person.
She'd spent the days since the ceremony largely out of public view, fielding calls from her board, her attorneys, and a handful of remaining partners still deciding whether to continue their association with her company. Somewhere in the middle of that difficult week, she had found herself returning again and again to the memory of the lobby, replaying the sound of her own laughter, wondering for the first time in longer than she could recall whether she'd misjudged something important. Daniel agreed to the meeting, choosing the same modest coffee shop where Sarah once brought him her worries, a quiet place with wooden tables and rain-streaked windows, far removed from glass towers and boardrooms. Elena arrived alone, without her usual entourage of assistants and lawyers, dressed more plainly than at any point during the entire ordeal, and sat across from him carrying a small folder of her own. Inside was a cashier's check, along with a written apology she'd drafted and redrafted several times the night before, unsure how to put into words the weight of what had happened. She placed both items on the table between them, along with two crisp $20, the exact sum that had started everything 3 days before the signing that broke her company's momentum. Daniel looked at the check for a long moment before sliding it back across the table, untouched. He picked up only the $40, the amount he'd originally been owed, folding the two bills carefully and placing them in his coat pocket. He told her plainly that he'd never needed her money, only for her to keep her word, and that the entire matter could have ended the very first afternoon if someone at her company had simply treated an ordinary request with ordinary respect. Elena tried once more to push the check across the table, insisting he'd earned far more than the settlement reflected, that the damage to his reputation and his time deserved real compensation. But Daniel only shook his head and repeated that money had never been the issue at any point in the story.
Elena sat in silence, the weight of the statement settling over her more heavily than any legal penalty had managed to. She thought back to the lobby, to the sound of her own laughter echoing off the marble floor, to the ease with which she'd waved away a man who'd done nothing except ask to be paid for work he honestly completed. She had looked at a man waiting quietly in her lobby and decided he wasn't worth her attention, that his request was too small to matter, that his time carried no value next to her own. 3 days later, that single decision, made in a moment of careless pride, had cost her company $12 million, driven away partners who trusted her for years, and unraveled a reputation she'd spent her entire career building, from nothing. She left the coffee shop that afternoon without the check ever having been accepted, carrying instead a lesson she'd spend a long time trying to fully absorb. In the months that followed, Daniel Ashford's independent consulting practice grew steadily, his name circulating quietly among developers and investment firms as someone whose word could be trusted completely, someone who documented everything and compromised on nothing, regardless of who sat across the table from him. Requests for his services arrived faster than he could accept them, many from companies that had heard the story secondhand and wanted, above all, an inspector who couldn't be pressured or dismissed. He stayed the same in every meeting, arriving early, measuring twice, refusing to sign anything he hadn't personally verified, unchanged by the sudden attention his name now attracted in certain circles. Nathan Cole, impressed by the composure and precision Daniel had shown throughout the entire ordeal, formally invited him to join the investment fund as a senior advisor on risk assessment, a role Daniel accepted on the condition that he could continue his independent inspections alongside it, unwilling to give up the field work that had shaped his entire career. The two men developed a quiet, professional respect for one another over the following months, built less on conversation than on the simple fact that each had proven, in his own way, that thoroughness mattered more than convenience.
Sarah Whitfield, after months of uncertainty and several difficult weeks searching for new work, found a position at a firm that valued exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous diligence that had once cost her a job and later helped expose the truth at Harrogate Urban Holdings. She often thought back to the evening she'd made the call to Daniel, a decision that had felt uncertain and even reckless at the time, and came to understand it as the moment she'd chosen, without fully realizing it, to trust her own judgment over the comfort of staying silent. The story of the man who was refused $40 and the company that lost $12 million because of it began circulating in business circles as a quiet lesson about the true cost of arrogance. Repeated at conferences, cited occasionally in articles about corporate governance and risk management. It became, over time, a reminder that the respect owed to any person, regardless of the size of the transaction in front of them, is never as small as it appears in the moment it's withheld, and that the true measure of a company often reveals itself not in how it treats its largest partners, but in how it treats the quiet, ordinary people it assumes no one is watching.